Thanks for the invitation. Just listening to my CV there, you may have noticed that it doesn't say anything about my university qualifications, and the reason for that is that I don't have any. I'm probably one of the last generation of people who can get through a reasonable sort of career without at any point managing to get a degree. But as a result of that, when I come into a place like this, I feel really intimidated and really quite inadequate, and really quite scared actually. Because I'm surrounded by people who are professionals at standing up here and giving lectures and so on. So I'll do my best for you and we'll see how we go. So the brief that I've been given today to talk about, a bit about New Zealand's history in terms of connectivity, where we've come from, where we are and where we're going. A bit about the digital divide, which is a subject very close to my heart. And something about how New Zealand is doing in making the use of our connectivity sector by sector. So, starting with a flashback to the late 1990s, and before that, telecommunications just about everywhere in the world was run by governments. And in the case of New Zealand, it was the New Zealand Post Office. There was just one telecommunications company. It was a branch of the Post Office. It was a boring, old-fashioned government department. And that was before telecommunications started to get really exciting because of first mobility and then data and the internet. And back in about 1987-88, we became the first country in the developed world to privatise telecommunications. So Telecom New Zealand was formed from the old telecommunications branch of the New Zealand Post Office. But when it came into became a private company, a public company I should say, we had no industry-specific regulation around telecommunications. All we had was the Commerce Act, which in fact allowed Telecom to trade on its monopoly position. So for a number of years, it charged some of the highest prices in the developed world and paid extraordinarily high dividends to its mainly American shareholders. So users became increasingly unhappy about this. The Commerce Commission tried to restrain it, but Telecom actually took the Commerce Commission to the Privy Council in London, which is the highest level of justice in the New Zealand system. We appealed to London. Very, very rarely happens, but once in a while. And the Privy Council in London, in their eternal wisdom, overturned the Commerce Commission and found in favour of Telecom, which meant the high prices got higher still, and the service got worse, and the shareholders got richer and richer. So Telecom was able to exploit its dominance in the market by forcing every potential competitor out of business. The reason for that, quite simply, is that in a network industry, if you own a natural monopoly, which in this case was the copper wires that went into everybody's home in New Zealand, you can use that monopoly to exploit a competitive advantage in every other part of the market. Nobody was ever going to dig up every suburban street in New Zealand and put another pair of copper lines into every home, and so Telecom was able to basically run the country on its own terms. And in those days, right through to the early 2000s, the government refused to listen to arguments about the need for industry-specific regulations, as had been done in every other country. So in about 2002, New Zealand was bottom equal of the OECD league table by every telecommunications measure. There were 23 countries in the OECD in those days. We were 22nd equal alongside Mexico. In Mexico, the telecommunications company was owned by the Prime Minister, which probably gave them even more advantage than our company did. But we were in a really, really bad way. Mobility was starting to come in. Telecom had obviously started off down the track of a cell phone company. And we had initially Bell South and then Vodafone really struggling for traction in that market. Every obstacle was put in their way. And for example, there was no number portability in those days. So a customer who wanted to switch from Telecom Mobile to Vodafone Mobile had to get a new telephone number. And that meant, of course, potentially losing customers, changing all your stationery, your business cards and so on. And it just was impossible for a new entrant to break in. So the Labour government came in about 2001, thereabouts, and about 2002 passed the Telecommunications Act with industry-specific regulation, which required that Telecom wholesale its services to other participants, mandated number portability, so you could change your phone company without changing your number, an access regime at a legislated price for its network, and the installation of a telecommunications commissioner. And that was the start of the step change for New Zealand. It was only the start. So for the period from 2002 to about 2010, there was a series of individual battles as we tried to get our regime into a competitive situation. Basically one of these battles every year. So we had number portability, we had the installation of the regulator, we had local loop unbundling, terminology for a requirement that if another carrier wanted to use the copper lines into somebody's home, it could do so at a regulated price set by an independent commissioner. We had the formation of the Telecommunications Forum, which worked on detailed standards and codes of practice for various aspects of the industry. We had a customer complaints code, disputes resolution system. We had operational separation, meaning that Telecom was required to have a separate wholesale department within it that dealt with other carriers, which in theory sat behind a block wall, and there was no information sharing between wholesale and the retail part of the company. That didn't work. Telecom went through the motions, but behind the scenes they didn't follow that. And so in very dramatic fashion around 2007 from memory, we got structural separation where Telecom and Chorus were divided off into two separate companies. And that was, I think, probably the biggest single move. Interestingly, though today those companies are Spark and Chorus. And so they're both children of Telecom, but as sometimes happens in families, there's a lot of sibling rivalry now, and Telecom and Chorus are absolutely at war, totally at war, which is actually a really great, well, Spark and Chorus I should say. So they're at war, and that's a really great thing for the consumer. We had co-location on cell towers. Up until this time, every company that was on the mobile market had to build its own towers, and there was a tremendous waste of money. There was a well-known site not far from here up on East Ridge, up above Kohimarama, a crossroads on the top of that ridge, and on the four sides of the crossroads there were cell towers for four different companies. In fact, any one of those towers could have housed all the equipment for all four of them, and so mandated co-location came in. We had mobile roaming, national mobile roaming. That meant that if a new entrant started, because nobody could afford to cover the whole country with a cellular network on day one, and so as they built out their network, the existing providers, at that point they were Telecom and Vodafone, were required to rent them space on their towers in the more remote areas so that they could get into business. And we had mobile phone termination charges, which is the subject of a whole presentation in itself, but basically that was a rort for Telecom and Vodafone to keep 2 degrees from getting market share. But we went through all those over the period up to about 2010, and at the end of that we've actually ended up with a very competitive market by world standards, a world-class internet, and we're way ahead of just about every other similar country. We're certainly way ahead of the Australians, which is always a nice place to be. The Australians have got their NBN network and they're still struggling at the beginning of that, mainly because in Australia it's a political football. The two parties, government and opposition parties, are completely divided about how the NBN should go, whereas we've been lucky in New Zealand that National and Labour have had a fairly broad agreement about how the telecommunications market should roll out. So by then, of course, we're getting to the point where the internet is what it's all about, and where fibre to the home and connectivity in rural New Zealand came to the forefront. And there came a point where certain things had to be done that were not commercially viable for the private sector. So the government started to step in. And this was about 2010, 2011. So both political parties agreed that we needed fibre to the home in urban New Zealand, and some kind of subsidised rollout of equivalent connectivity in the rural parts. So we had the ultra-fast broadband project, which is run effectively by the 4 local fibre companies: Chorus, Ultrafast Fibre, North Power and Enable Networks. And that's gone reasonably well. And then we've had the Rural Broadband Initiative, which RBI 1, the first phase of that, was run by Vodafone, and phase 2, which is going on at the moment, and I'll talk more about, the Rural Connectivity Group, which is a consortium of the 3 mobile companies, and the WISPs, and I'll talk more about them as well. But I should say, just by way of disclosure, that one of my roles is that I provide the secretariat for WISPA, which is the industry group for the wireless ISPs. So I think very kindly of those guys because they help to pay for my groceries. So you need to know that I have a degree of bias there. So UFB stages 1 and 2 just about complete. I think most people would regard them as highly successful. Sometimes you hear complaints. Some of the Chorus installations have not been great. It's had its controversy along the way, but a very large chunk of urban New Zealand now has fibre to the home or availability of that, and I think most people are pretty happy with that. I have fibre at my home down in Whakatane, and it's as good as anything I would get in Ponsonby or the inner suburbs of Wellington. Really, really good. RBI 1, somewhat successful. That was rolled out by Vodafone. Probably under-specced with hindsight. A lot of those towers now just don't have the capacity to cope with today's demand. RBI 2, which is going on as we speak, is, as I put it there, a game of 2 halves. The contracts were all signed a year ago, and there were 2 parties effectively. One was the Rural Connectivity Group, Spark, Vodafone and 2 Degrees, and the other is the WISPs, who I've kind of bundled there as one party, but there's actually about 10 of them directly engaged in this. The WISPs are racing ahead. We've got every few days there's a new site opening up and more rural people being connected for the internet. The Rural Connectivity Group, on the other hand, whose contract was signed at the same time, have opened, I think, 1 tower in Haast out of about 450 that they're contracted to do. So it just shows that the little guys are often the quicker off the mark. So I think what that demonstrates is a clash of cultures, really, between the 3 mobile companies with this consortium and the WISPs. So the RCG, they're corporate, they're nationwide, some of them are global, they're very expensive, they're right into marketing and beating their chests every time they open one site. You'd think the whole world had changed. They've been contracted predominantly because of the need to fill in gaps in the cellular market for road safety reasons and so on, although there is some overlap of that because they provide data services as well. The WISPs, on the other hand, are driven by data services. They're generally local, they're small businesses, they typically employ somewhere between 8 and 15 people, some of them go up to 35. They're very economical, flexible, and they rely very much on word of mouth for their advertising. So none of them are known outside their own district, but collectively now they're starting to become a significant market force. There is overlap between those two because the RCG sites will obviously do data as well. And so one of the unintended but inevitable side effects is that in some cases a service that is currently provided by WISPs out of private investment is effectively being overbuilt by the RCG using public money, and there's nothing that riles a businessman more than to find that an investment that they've made at their own expense is being overbuilt by taxpayer subsidised funds. But there's an acceptance of the inevitability of that, and hopefully as the RCG moves forward it'll be mainly driven by cellular rather than by data. So as I said, the WISPs are racing ahead. So in summary, what we now have is a very vibrant multiplayer market. You've got the 4 LFCs there. You've got retail service providers something over 60 of them around New Zealand that you can buy retail services from. You've got 40 odd WISPs. You've got the competition now internationally as of a few days ago. You've got the Southern Cross cable and the Hawaii cable. You've got the Rural Connectivity Group and a whole lot of others there sort of sitting in the wings with various levels of service. We've gone from having the least competitive telecommunications market in the developed world 15, 20 years ago to one of the most. So a little bit more about the WISPs. So they're wireless internet service providers. It's about 40. They've got about 40,000 customers collectively. They specialise in rural and remote areas. Their core business is wireless. They bounce signals around from hilltop to hilltop and then down into the valleys where it reaches the customer. And they have thousands of these sites around New Zealand now. A lot of them resell copper services and fibre. Effectively, they produce city-grade speeds out in rural and remote New Zealand, and with a very high level of reliability. One of the one of the famous stories is the Kaikoura earthquake, when Chorus, Vodafone, and Spark all had their networks go down, but the local WISP, AmuriNet, stayed online uninterrupted and was able to go in there and connect up to places like the supermarket. Because until the FPOS terminals were working again, the locals couldn't buy any groceries. So it was the WISP who stayed online and the big guys didn't. So there's a story in that. That's a typical WISP site. Your WISP can build that for probably $5,000 or $10,000. So what you're looking at there is there's a hilltop in the eastern Wairarapa, about an hour inland from Masterton, about an hour seaward from Masterton. So the big round dishes are pointed at other similar sites on the adjacent hills, bouncing the signal around, and the smaller rectangular ones, the multi-point ones that are directed down to the valley, where they're connecting somewhere between 5 and 20 farmhouses. And you've got solar panels, obviously, and there are batteries out of sight in the box at the bottom there. And that site will run literally for months at a time without anyone needing to go there. If it does break down, if the batteries start to get a bit flat, a light pops up in the network operator's operations centre, and they can either go out there and top the battery up, or they can just ask the local farmer if he'd mind doing it while he's on the hilltop, because the typical deal is they go to the farmer and say, hey, could we use a little bit of your hilltop to put an antenna up to serve all your community, and in return for that we'll give you free broadband. So it's a win-win situation. So that's a fairly typical one. There are plenty of bigger and more sophisticated ones as well. It's Mount Taranaki on the right-hand side there. That's a really big WISP site that is serving, I think, 180 customers around various parts of Taranaki.
Does that one have a backup generator?
It probably does, yeah. They pretty much all have solar. Most of them have a backup the big ones have a backup generator. Otherwise, these guys keep half a dozen generators in their office, and they can get up there in an hour or so if the battery starts going down. And very often too, the farmers are very supportive of this sort of thing, and they'll go and check the water on the batteries from time to time if they're passing.
Is that like a 10-kilometre range?
Sorry?
What's the range on the...
Technical question, I don't know, to be quite honest. I'd take a guess and say it might be 20 or 30 kilometres, but I am guessing at that. Yeah. So where we're going now, RBI3, people are starting to think about and how it might differ from RBI2. Problem is that each stage of rural broadband is more challenging and more costly than the one before, simply because we're getting into more and more isolated areas with sparse populations. The other side of that is that from a user point of view, the further you are from civilization, the greater the benefit of the connectivity is. So in Whakatane, I live 3 kilometres from the bank. My broadband saves me having to go into the bank because I can do my banking over the internet, but that's only a small saving because it only costs me $2 or $3 for petrol to go there. If, on the other hand, I live in Ruatahuna, up in the boondocks of the Uraweras, and I'm 100 k's from a bank, then the saving of not having to go to the bank is vastly greater. So the benefit is higher, but the cost is higher. Current government thinking, as far as I can see, is the next stage will be more community involvement, user self-identification. One of the shortcomings, I think, of the of RBI2 was that you've had a guy sitting in an office in Auckland with lots of maps and Google Maps and all sorts of stuff, working out where the missing subscribers are. And that's a very imprecise exercise, because not everyone wants to be connected to the internet. There are a few who don't. And also because it doesn't always show where the existing services are available. So I think we need to move more to user self-identification so that we're not wasting perfectly good taxpayers' money putting connectivity somewhere that it's never going to be used. And I think there's a mood for more of the WISPs and less of the cellular companies, for the simple reason that, as I said, our guys are out there doing this constantly, whereas the mobile companies are only just starting to get their act together. The interesting development will be the 2019 Rugby World Cup, which of course is going to be streamed rather than relying on Sky TV. And that'll be a very interesting exercise, because it'll put strains on the whole of New Zealand's connectivity infrastructure like it's never seen before. Spark won that contract unexpectedly. Apparently they apply for a lot of sports rights from time to time, but it's kind of cheeky rather than a really serious attempt. And they got a bit of a fright when they suddenly discovered they'd won this particular one, because there hadn't been a lot of planning gone on behind it. So there's a real scramble going on now to work out how the hell we're going to actually make this thing work. And the irony, of course, is that if the New Zealand internet collapses under the weight of all the rugby viewing, it'll bring down the government, even though they've had absolutely nothing to do with the whole process. So it is, on the one hand, it's a very big opportunity to actually move New Zealand in the digital direction, away from old-fashioned terrestrial, but on the other, there's quite a risk associated with it. So it'll be very interesting to see how it all goes.
So they should be looking at what's happened with the World Cup or the football.
Oh yeah,
because there's a lot of major problems with that being online.
Yeah. There are quite a few examples around the world. Most of them have not gone particularly well, it's got to be said. So there are a lot of people out there, New Zealand people there, looking to see what went wrong and how we can do it better. Okay, the digital divide. What is it and how can we fix it? So I haven't actually seen a definition, but that's my homegrown definition. It's the opportunities gap between people who have access to digital communication and those who don't. And in theory, the digital era should decrease inequality, because in theory you've got this great thing called the internet that everyone can get hold of, and it should give a lot more opportunity to people in different countries which are relatively deprived, different suburbs, different economic circumstances and so on. When I was a kid, my education was supported by the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and every few months a smartly dressed salesman would knock on the door and try to persuade my parents to buy the Encyclopaedia Britannica so that to help my schooling. And I remember they once did, and I think they took a mortgage on the house, to quite literally, in order to buy 20 or so volumes of a book that was out of date 2 years before it was ever printed. Nowadays, the equivalent is to make sure that your kids have got access to a digitally based education, which in real terms is cheaper, but it's still beyond the ability of many families. So a digital divide can be due to geography, whether you're urban or rural, whether you're in a dense or sparse population area. So the people who can't get the internet, at this stage, can't get it, end of story. It can be due to deprivation. Even if you've got access to really good internet, if you can't afford to pay for it, then that's a digital divide issue as well. And it can be due to attitude, because there is a small section of the community that actually doesn't want to get involved in the digital era. They're quite happy the way they were, thank you very much. And how long that will go on, I don't know. In my view, the big concern about the digital divide is kids. And the Google Classroom approach that is now being taken in most schools tends to assume that every child will come to school with a digital device and that they will be taking it home and able to get online to do their assignments and their homework overnight and contribute to the class blog and collaborate with other kids in their class to do their assignments and so on. So a child who does not have all those things is actually getting more and more disadvantaged every day. So the digital divide for children should be diminishing, but it's increasing because of those reasons I've just talked about. And there's a lot of work going on. People like Computers in Homes have been working since the late 1990s, recycling old computers from government agencies and corporations and universities and so on, and putting them out there with families who couldn't otherwise afford them, and getting them online. And some great work going on in that space. But there's never enough money for those things. So my suggestion of a solution is the government should be adopting a target of having a digitally based education for every student sooner rather than later. The end of this current political term would be a really good time to aim for it, and that means a device that they can take to school and take home, connectivity wherever they want to learn, not just at school, not just at home, but on the school bus and at the public library and so on, and digitally capable teachers. It's a big challenge, but it's one that we need to adopt if we're serious about getting rid of the digital divide. So the third leg of what I'm talking about is the sector by sector, how is New Zealand doing in taking advantage of the enormous opportunities that all this connectivity has brought us. So there are some sectors that have done really well, and you can't go past the financial services sector at the top of the pack. Banking is an totally different industry to what it was 20 years ago. The ATM machine, FPOS, internet banking, all of those things, they have changed their customer interface totally. The automated option always comes first. You can go through a lifetime now without walking into the branch of a bank. You can open your account, do the whole lot, apply for mortgages, whatever you want to do. Just about everything can now be done online. So you could, in theory, never go into a bank branch, which is probably quite a good thing in the regions because most of them have been closed down and replaced by $2 shops. So the financial services sector has really done a good job. Education, I think, has done really well. I have great admiration for our teachers in the way in which they have grasped the opportunity to use the internet as their basic, the foundation of their teaching and learning. But with the proviso that we've got to look after those kids who don't have the same opportunity. Travel and aviation, you never walk into a travel agency anymore, I don't. You get to the airport and you've already checked in on your mobile phone. Every time I fly, there's another innovation. Like now in New Zealand, you scan your own baggage tag and put the baggage on the conveyor. Do everything except fly the plane yourself now. But that sector, and Air New Zealand's been a leader in that area, and I think we should be quite proud of that. Government services, I think, have done pretty well. It's almost a pleasure now to pay your tax because the Inland Revenue site is so user-friendly. I said almost. And most other government services are pretty good. Internet trading, we've got some good success stories there. My Food Bag would be one. Countdown with its internet ordering now, and they deliver all your shopping to you for, $5 or $6 a pop or something, which is quite good. I've never used it, but I know a lot of my neighbours use that. And in the earlier stages, TradeMe was a really good example. So there's been some good sort of retail applications. And I think New Zealand does pretty well in social media. We know how to use it quite well. I always remember back in 2002, when I was working for the Telecommunications Users Association, we ran a big conference in Nelson about broadband applications and how the internet could transform New Zealand. And this one was focused particularly on rural and farming. There was a group working on farming applications. They brainstormed this for 2.5 days, and they came up with animal traceability, with precision application of fertiliser, so that the fertiliser truck would be linked to the GPS and it wouldn't waste fertiliser on the stony ground or the driveways or whatever. Precision irrigation for the same reason, so it doesn't go on the places, the water doesn't go where it's not wanted and so on. And we came up with all these really good, quite futuristic ideas, many of which in the subsequent 15 years have come to fruition. But what I always remember is there was a young guy there from Young Farmers, and right at the end of this he said, well, this is all very well, he said, but you know, for me as a young rural guy, what I really want the internet for, and my mates that I want it for, is so we can go on the dating sites and pick up the girls on equal terms with the fellas in the cities. And at the time, I thought it was a flippant comment, but I came to realise that the social value to people who are living in rural areas is really substantial, and that's an economic benefit to the farmers, the fact that they can get staff without the disadvantage of them feeling socially excluded. So what I thought was a throwaway line and a bit of a laugh actually was very, very profound. So, you know, we shouldn't forget that the social benefits actually have a value. There are some opportunities that I think New Zealand has not yet realised. Now, in agriculture, we've just recently had a really good example of one that's failed, and that's NAIT, the National Animal Identification and Tracing Scheme. Put in there at considerable expense by taxpayers for the benefit of farmers, so that in the event of a food safety emergency, a biosecurity situation or whatever, it would be possible to work out which animal or which cut of meat had come from which particular farm. Unfortunately, it seems that many of the farmers have boycotted that for whatever reason, and it hasn't been working well, and I've heard a range of excuses. Oh, we don't like it because it's just foisted on us by the bureaucrats in Wellington. Oh, the animal ear tags fall off when they walk past the hedges. The system's too clunky. The scanners are too expensive. One that also resonated with me, which I think was very honest, was at the moment there's a lot of inter-farm trading of stock, which the Inland Revenue Department doesn't know about, and if we have a tracing system, then all of a sudden that'll be within the tax net. But whatever the reason, we have what should be a really, really important animal identification and tracing system that the farmers have not embraced. And just in the last couple of months, we have spent $890 million as taxpayers trying to deal with M. bovis, which arguably could have been caught and identified a lot earlier if we'd had a comprehensive tracing system. So generally, I'll give the farmers a reasonably good mark, but with a real black mark on that particular one, and somebody's going to have to fix it. And what I don't get is that the Ministry of Primary Industries have the power to prosecute people who don't participate in the NAIT system, and have apparently only ever made one prosecution, and that guy got fined $150. I think there's a lot of opportunity in regional development. Now, I've spent most of my working life in Wellington and Auckland and a brief period in Australia, and I've just in the last 5 years moved out into the regions in Whakatane. And I sit out in my idyllic, sunny, clean air home, and if I need to drive anywhere, I can be up to 110 kilometres an hour within about 3 kilometres of where I live, and beautiful views and whatever. And I think of all you guys out there on the Southern Motorway, sitting there in a pool of carbon monoxide, moving along at 1 kilometre an hour and wondering whether you're ever going to get home. Now, New Zealand would be a better place if we could distribute our population a lot more evenly around it, and particularly people with families. Any part of rural New Zealand is very attractive to live in. And one of the benefits that the internet was meant to bring and has brought is the ability to work independent of your location. So you guys can go home at night and you can carry on with your studies or your work or whatever from home or from wherever else you happen to be. And so we should be able to decentralise New Zealand's population. We've got this housing crisis. It's not just an Auckland housing crisis, it's a national one. But it would be, if we need another 10,000 houses, it would be a lot easier to build 1,000 each in 10 regional towns than 10,000 in Auckland. And so I reckon we should be making really positive moves to decentralise ourselves, give the regions a boost, give all of us a better lifestyle, and the internet enables that, and we haven't even touched the sides of that opportunity. Digital divide we've talked about, and health. Health's a particular passion of mine because I've spent a lot of time working in health IT. It's lagging decades behind everyone else in terms of digitising its customer interface. So again, coming back to banking as the example, we go for the automated option first, the internet banking, the ATM machine, whatever. We don't actually get referred to a real person until we've got something really, really high up the ladder that requires, quite a lot of human input. And when we do get up to the real person, we start with the most junior and we work our way up. Health, on the other hand, the first thing we do when we've got a cough or a cold or whatever it might be is ring up the GP, and we go straight to the GP, who's the most expensive person in the practice, and he or she might delegate us down to a practice nurse or a pharmacist or whatever. We generally start at the top and work down, and there's no real automated option. Now we've got to start thinking about how we can learn from the sectors that have automated their customer interface and translate some of those learnings into a more efficient health system. Because there are opportunities, there are pilots everywhere in health. Everywhere I look, and I've worked in this sector closely, there are hundreds and hundreds of pilots, and I've worked on some of them, and most of them are successful. I'm talking about video, I'm talking about the use of different technologies to actually make the health system more efficient. They're all done on an incredibly small scale, and most of them work. But then when they do work, nobody can work out how on earth you can actually grow that from a pilot into business as usual. And so they stop. I'll give you an example of one in a minute. So we don't have an ability to migrate them to business as usual. The causes, there's not good leadership in health, and I blame that on the Ministry of Health and successive ministers. There's no sector vision. At some point, coming back to banking, and I never thought I'd be standing up in front of a group and praising the banks, but I have to on this one. At some point, somebody in the international banking scene said, gosh, this internet thing, hey, we could have machines, we could have a hole in the wall that dispenses money automatically instead of having tellers. We could have people actually accessing their own financial records online and save ourselves having to print out and hand out statements all the time. Somebody had a vision to start all that. There is no vision in health about how we can take advantage of the digital era. We've got an extraordinary structure. We've got 20 district health boards. We've got regional shared services companies that sit across the top of those and run the IT and some of the other services. We've got the ministry. We've got the Royal College of General Practitioners. We've got all the primary health organisations, which are collective bodies that sit between the DHB and the general practices. And then you've got allied health services, you've got testing laboratories, you've got physios and so on and so forth. It's an incredibly complicated structure. Nobody understands it. Nobody understands how the money flows around it. And so everyone is terrified to tinker in case they bring the whole thing crashing down. It really is that bad. So we've got to sort that one. We've got constant underfunding. Health is constantly in a state of crisis. Clinicians think they can speak on behalf of customers. They think they know better than we do what's good for us, which is fine when they're wielding a scalpel, but not really fine when we're trying to talk about what the future of health services should be, in which they've got a big vested interest. And there's a sense of despair. The good people working in IT in that sector, but they've kind of given up. I'll give you a little example. I was at a meeting of one of the shared services companies which has 2 or 3 DHBs below it, and I was doing some consumer representation work on their 10-year IT plan. We were going through an endless list of IT systems and what might have to happen to them over that 10-year period. We came to one called Nurse Call, and somebody said, there won't be any change to that. I said, hang on a minute, what's Nurse Call? And they said, that's the button that you push in the hospital ward if you want to call the nurse. And I said, well, hang on a minute. I said, we're talking about a 10-year plan here. I said, wouldn't it be a whole lot better if instead of having a push button, you had a telephone? Because then you can press the button for the nurse, and the nurse will say, what would you like? And you can tell him or her, I want some pain relief. I want a bedpan. I want a flat white, whatever it might be. And that way, when they come up to the ward in the middle of the night, they're only making 1 return journey instead of 2. Wouldn't that really be a good labour-saving thing? I was quite proud of that, to come up with that, because I just sort of hit on that at the spur of the moment. And there was a silence, and there was a guy next to me who was a senior doctor, and he said, it'll never happen. And I said, well, isn't it a good idea? And he said, yeah, it's a great idea, but it'll never happen. And I said, why not? And he said, because we're funded by the government. Now, I come back to my point. a sense of despair among good people in the sector. We're funded by the government, we're always short of money, there is never any money for a good idea, no matter how good it is. And so that's a lot of the problem. So health is a huge opportunity waiting to happen. So my solution for that would be to re-engineer the whole structure and process in our 20th century health system so that we can capture the digital opportunities. We've got to find a way to do that. It needs to be a consumer-led action group, and the opportunities, solutions for ageing at home with technology support. When I start getting old, I actually want to stay in my own home. I want to be supported by home security, personal security, social inclusion through my TV set and video, monitored alarms, all that sort of thing. I want to be able to talk to the doctor or to a nurse or whoever by video before I go down to the surgery. We do dumb things. I mean, when there's an epidemic, one of the great tragedies of human behaviour, when there's an epidemic, and some of you will remember SARS and swine flu and some of those, first thing we all do, if we think we've got SARS or swine flu, is hop in the car and go down and sit in a waiting room with 50 other people who think they might have it too. And so if we didn't have it when we went in, we probably have by the time we come out. Now that's an absolute tragedy of human behaviour, when in fact we could go online on a video, have a group consultation with someone who can help us to self-diagnose, and possibly get medication and whatever it is sorted without leaving the home. So, there are glaring opportunities there. The use of video as an everyday communication tool and devolution of responsibilities down the stack. It's a great resistance by doctors to letting nurses do more or pharmacists do more or whatever. And we've got to crack that and move through it. Telehealth, I'll just give you if I can make this work, hopefully.
There was a question.
Sorry.
Yeah, the helping in the home stuff. I'm aware that the Blind Foundation does that at the moment.
Yes.
Do you know of anybody else that does that?
I think there are a number, and there are several, and it's becoming quite commonplace overseas as well. But in New Zealand, they're all they're little silos. We need a national vision of where we're going to go with all that. I don't know whether I can get this video to work, but I won't spend time if I can't. No, I knew that would happen. As soon as you get a technology audience, everything packs up. Right. Regional development, I've talked a bit about, but location independent working, the need to rebalance New Zealand population. My first option on that would be to start with the government. Just about all our taxpayer money is spent in Wellington. Wellington is a seismic risk. It's falling apart. What we used to call the Kaikoura earthquake, we should really call the Wellington earthquake, because there was something like 100 uninhabitable buildings in that city. We know it was a dumb place with hindsight to put the capital city because of the seismic problems there. Auckland is too big. Why would you put your largest city on an isthmus where it's really, really difficult to get transport to all the outlying areas? Christchurch, again seismic. Dunedin, the most horrible little microclimate that you could find for about 100 kilometres in any direction. The early settlers did not do a good job in working out where to put our main cities. So New Zealand would be a better place if we could decentralise. But government services, let's get the government services out of Wellington. With location independent working, they don't all have to be in high-rise buildings. And I suspect that one of the reasons they are all so centralised is the egos of the ministers who like to sit in the beehive and look out the window and gaze and think, that 15-storey tower over there is all me. There's also, because of that, a high disparity between household incomes in the regions and in the main centres. Whakatane, which would be fairly typical, average household income is something in the order of 80,000. Auckland, I think it's about 110. Wellington, about 115. Moving a few hundred of those people to various regional centres would be very, very valuable. Benefits, aligning the demand for housing and other infrastructure to places where the gap can more easily be closed. Capture the productivity benefit from the reduced downtime. I mean, how much productivity is lost with people sitting on Highway 1, around here? I mean, the Productivity Commission comes out with reports saying our productivity is not increasing, not improving. I know why. They've only got to look out the window and see all the traffic sitting there. And a better lifestyle for all. So my solution on regional development, require every government agency to carve out a business unit of 200 to 500 staff and relocate it to a regional centre. And I'd want to do that within the current parliamentary term, if I was the minister. And I think, once the government starts doing this, the private sector will follow that lead. And all of a sudden we'll take pressure off our big cities, we'll have better lifestyles, and we'll have a reinvention of the regions. Further centralisation moves should be to the regions, not to the main centres. So when the department comes along to the minister and says, Minister, we want to relocate this particular call centre from Ashburton to Wellington, he will say, no, we want you to do it the other way around. Centralise by all means, centralise it on Ashburton. And then stand back and wait for the productivity gains and the happier people. So in summary, we've done really, really well in connectivity so far. So while we may moan and groan about the people who haven't got it, we should remember that we've come from very much on the back foot, 22nd equal in the OECD in 1999, way ahead of the Australians now, way ahead of most other countries that have got our kind of dispersed population. The final stage in rural connectivity will be expensive, but it is achievable. The digital divide is a really serious issue and we're only tinkering. If we can't solve the digital divide for the current generation of adults, let's at least try to solve it for the current generation of kids. And 4 specific opportunities there: regional development, agriculture, health, and solving the digital divide. So that's what I think, if I was the minister, which I'm not likely to be, is what would be on my agenda. So there's the summary of all that, which I've already talked about, and that's me. Thank you.